Right, welcome to the January 10th meeting of the Issaquah Environmental Board. I'm Jamie Finch and I'll be your chair tonight. Due to the hybrid nature of the meeting, we will have members attending in person and online. For those online, please keep yourself muted while you're not speaking. Raise your hand to indicate your desire to speak. We'll do our best to catch you and then hop in if we're still missing you. Anyone in person, as we always do, please put your name tags up on the side when you would like to speak. I don't think we'll have any topics that we need to summarize. Maybe we will with one of the items tonight, summarizing agreement around topics. And if so, we'll summarize that and then have any comments. Summarized. I think with that, we can move into attendance. Stacey, do you want to take us?
Tom Anderson.
Here.
Nancy Davidson.
Here.
Jamie Finch.
Here.
Raj Gapanti.
Here.
Joy Lewis. Here. Ashwin Kanan.
Here.
Ashwin Manoharan. Don McWilliams.
Here.
Ann Newcomb, I know, is planning to join us virtually. She doesn't look like she's here yet. Janet Wall.
Here.
Dixie Bear. Here. Alex Lee Tigner.
Here.
We have quorum.
Thank you, Stacey. Do we have any comments on the minutes from our previous meeting? Hearing none, those are approved as presented. Next up, I don't think we have any public that are going to be speaking. I don't think we also had any public comments.
No written public comments. We do have one member of the public online, but has not indicated an interest to speak tonight.
All right, well, I think with that, then we can move into our agenda items. The first one being the climate vulnerability assessment communication concepts. Oh, do we want to introduce Nick?
Sure,
Why don't we do
let's do that
Okay,
real
let's
quick.
do that.
All right.
Missed that on my agenda.
Sorry. Nick, do you mind turning on your camera real quick? We'll just do a brief introduction. So Nick Horn just joined us on Monday. As similar to Kathleen, Nick is a Civic Spark Fellow. Kathleen will maybe do a very quick reminder of Civic Spark during her presentation. Nick joined us from California, is going to be with us through August, is working on a number of climate projects. We'll be taking on some of the work that Kathleen has done so far for the city, but then also working on a number of additional projects like the Climate Challenge, helping with the Sustainability Fair, working on our Resilience Hub projects and a number of other ones. So I'm sure the board will be hearing from Nick later in the year presenting on the projects that they've been working on. Nick, do you want to say anything to the members of the board, or you can also wait till you're here in person too?
Yeah, I think you covered it, but I'm glad to be here listening. Thank you.
Okay.
Now we will move into the climate vulnerability assessment concepts.
Great, thank you, Stacey. Good evening, board, members of the public. My name is Kathleen Hillary, and I am the Civic Spark Fellow working with the Office of Sustainability. As a brief reminder, that's a AmeriCorps program that's recently been folded underneath the Washington Climate Corps, and the fellowship offers various professional development opportunities for fellows to work with municipalities and departments working on sustainability and sustainability adjacent topics and engage in other various trainings in the field. My purpose tonight is to provide you all with preliminary communications material concepts to inform our community about the climate vulnerability assessment, its findings, and lean into various connections for follow-on information, resources, and actions that our neighbors can take. Tonight, we'll discuss a very high-level overview of what the CVA found and associated messages we'd like to make clear to the community and the concepts themselves. Please. First, let's remember that the ICAP identified the need to conduct a climate vulnerability assessment with ICAP Action CR 2.1 to understand the specific climate impacts which threaten Issaquah and strategies for enhancing community adaptive capacity, especially of vulnerable groups and municipal infrastructure. The CVA analyzed 4 general sectors: built environment, natural systems and stormwater, water resources and sewer, public health and well-being, and then the 10 subsectors that you can see on your screen. The graphic depicts climate impacts to these associated sectors, the broad sectors, including wildfire, heat, and consequences of extreme precipitation. This graphic details the relative vulnerabilities from high to low of the subsectors, taking into account both climate risk, which factors in sensitivity and exposure to climate impacts, as well as the adaptive capacity of the sectors themselves, which include the capability of systems, biodiversity, and institutions to moderate, cope, or adapt to climate change. Next slide, please. Conducting this assessment allowed staff to understand various areas of improvement, and the CVA did circulate very much so among the staff. What we'd like to do is communicate the assessment in its full form, but also in truncated forms, by communicating both the assessment itself and how various elements of the ICAP address identified gaps from the assessment, plans for future work, etc. By offering this transparency, we can facilitate community inclusion and allow individuals and family units to determine what preparations they need to build resilience for themselves and among neighbors. These targeted communications materials can't distill 50 pages of information, but we can generate exposure to the various facets that were held within that assessment and also building community resilience. Next slide, please. We want to communicate the findings accurately and widely without being reductive, but that's going to take a lot of different communications material in many different ways. So tonight you're only getting 3, and those are a municipal website page update and inclusion of the CVA to provide a central location for the most accurate and up-to-date information. It would also house a link to the full report and various other communications materials and 2-page memos, reducing the 50 pages into various sectors. And it would also be a place where community members could find links to follow on resources for preparing for extreme weather. We'd like to also do a school flyer or poster, similar tool to facilitate youth inclusion, and perhaps even incorporate some coverage of multilingual family structures by children who attend ISD schools, bringing these things home to family members who may not have English as a first language. And a community notice, flyer, or similar signage tool, which could foster neighborhood level awareness in order to build resilience, have a plan among neighbors, and have some constant signage or similar stationary landmark, keeping resilience front of mind. As stated, a website update to Issaquah's municipal website itself builds on existing dashboards to present a central database for information. This would have a link to vulnerability assessment, which you can see in the bottom left corner. This mock-up is on the emergency management page, but it does not have to be housed here specifically. This is just a concept. It could also have its own web page. Housing it here or on its own web page allows us to incorporate links to additional resources as previously stated. We anticipate that the key elements of such an update would include the report itself and the 2-page memos, as well as resources to human services, weather trackers from NOAA or the National Weather Service, and any city plans that specifically address gaps identified by the CVA. as well as whatever other materials are determined by staff and boards. There's also an example of an ArcGIS story map from the city of Shoreline that uses interactive storytelling to present information graphics, photos, definitions, city projects, and community opportunities to learn more. We can click on this link if you would like to see that example. I see yeses from the crowd.
Scroll through briefly, give you an idea. I don't know if folks are familiar with story maps, but this is just to give that.
We may need to.
Oh, okay. Which means that it is.
You may just be sharing the power. And here's the example of how a story map can be used. Built this particular one from ArcGIS to create maps and interactive links to additional fact sheets and pictures from the community. Please. This is, again, a mock-up of a school flyer. It is not necessarily the exact material, but it's a graphic that is designed for middle school-ish aged children, slightly younger. What we'd like to do with these pieces of school information is to facilitate youth exposure to the conversation while including them in the conversation in an age-appropriate way, in a place where there's already structure for topics that can sometimes be difficult to discuss, and use multilingual family structures whose children attend ISD schools to bring information from the school through the child to the family. One of the things that I've been thinking about is using QR codes also in order to have, especially for older students who have technology and who are curious about learning more, to have something that is on a 24/16 poster, but they can get access to further information. Next slide, please. And then community signage. These are merely examples of signs that exist. The entering and leaving tsunami hazard zones are on Whidbey Island in various places, as well as elsewhere in the United States on the West Coast, wildfire evacuation routes. And then I'm sure that folks are familiar with the volcano evacuation route signages around Mount Rainier. These are merely ideas and can also be different, more stationary boards or signages for directions to resilience hubs once we have physical locations for those areas. And also shared with us some education material relating to idle-free zones. So that might be a sign option within the community, especially around schools, post offices, other places where idling is common, like pharmacy drive-throughs or banks. But this is where we have some next steps and questions for you. Next slide, please. We're going to be presenting to the Human Services Commission and sending a memo to the Equity Board to gain their insight into this topic as well. We'll publish the CVA report. It is currently with our communications team, and then we'll continue developing communications material based on all of that feedback. Slide, please. What we have for some discussion tonight is, do you think these materials presented in a good way to educate the public? And what kinds of community signage are you interested in your neighborhoods? Are there other materials or strategies that you'd like to see employed in the community and or schools or elsewhere to facilitate awareness about future climate impacts and resources? And how do you and your neighbors currently get your information, or what changes would benefit how you get your information? Thank you.
Raj, question, go ahead.
So I have a few comments actually. So I did look at the website, the Shoreline City of Shoreline website. I think the ArcGIS storytelling map, is a great idea. I do think the QR code is great too, especially for high schoolers. For capturing the school audience or reaching more ISD, community members, I think you should reach out to the school, but basically you should reach out to most of the ISD schools have green teams, and some of them are pretty active. Most of the green team, high school green teams actually post updates, every week or every 2 weeks on Instagram. They hold events and they do a bunch of actually active events with students as well as for the community. So you should reach out to them, and these CVA materials, especially if you give them the QR codes, that would be great. They can actually reach a lot of young people. As well as the other way I have seen is in ISD newsletters. I have seen a lot of information, not necessarily just for schools, but impacting the communities in ISD pass through in different forms. So that also may be a good way, to reach out to basically publish the information regarding your CVA. The other question, I did look at the website, and one of the suggestions I had was you can also add the shelters information or the resilience areas, as you mentioned, once available and once confirmed, especially for the communities which will be more affected during extreme heat or climate events. I know King County sends notices or texts during extreme heat events. So something like that, if you have permanent structures available for public to access during any extreme events, they should be listed on the website as well. That's all. Thank you.
Raj. Don, and then Tom.
I just think that's very well presented. I love the flyer. I love the story map idea. I've always been a big fan of story map. I'm making it right up in front so you can see it. Comment on your community signage. The idea of community signage is great. I can see a wildfire sign in Issaquah here, possibly a flooding sign, some flooding down in Issaquah Creek from time to time. And then also you have opportunities in Issaquah where in the parks, especially like where you cross a stream or whatnot, some person interpretive signage. To get into this a little more detail for those that want to stop and well done. I look forward to it.
Don, go ahead, Tom.
Okay, just reflecting on how I like to get up to date and keep informed on city-related things. I very much enjoy the Issaquah Insider email-based newsletter, and the city does a very nice job on that. And related to that, you can sign up to be informed of, get alerts about various and sundry other things relating to community events and emergencies, etc. These are powerful tools. It isn't the answer for everyone, but it is the answer for many. And so that coupling that into the flow of information, I mean, having a website out there, when something is added to the city's website, I mean, I don't go look at the city's website very often looking, well, I wonder what's new here. That's not how I get informed. I get informed by this channel of information coming at me, and then I choose to investigate further by following the links. And I think that's a very good model to follow for dissemination of information and reaching people. I think if you think about those tentacles of the email flow, and well, then how do we build on that to connect to people who aren't all about the email thing, the other social channels? Finding a way to actively engage in those other channels is key too, particularly for some demographics. And on the QR code, I think that's a great thing for a certain demographic as well. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when QR codes were strictly a geeky thing, but it is now mainstream, and COVID has helped us get there. The idea of going into a restaurant, for example, and scanning the QR code for the menu. I mean, this is just, everybody knows how to do that now. A few years ago, everybody didn't know how to do that. And so that is mainstream now, and that's a powerful method to help people connect to the core content, which is somewhere else, for both in terms of the email channels as well as signage. It's, I guess, particularly powerful in the signage, both signage in terms of in the public corridors, along trails and sidewalks, etc., as well as in the school and other public settings. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Go to Alex and then Nancy.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to see the final products when they start coming out. I agree with everyone that the story map is really great, and especially like relative to the city's website, it's a lot more interactive and a lot more like eye-pleasing. On it, it's got the fact sheets, and I really like those because it presents things much more graphically. And I think trying to focus on as little text as possible with eye-catching graphics to try and communicate as quickly as possible the main points that you're trying to get across and draw people in is going to be really key with any of the tools that we use. I liked what Praj was saying about involving the students more than just putting flyers up at the schools. I think that there are great green teams that would take on projects to try and help educate, like take the information and distill it to their classmates. I think that's a really good way to help get that information and have them take some ownership of it and also have it communicated on a like scale that the students would be more interested in. So I'd love to see how we could work more with the schools and not just provide them with materials. I'd also love to have, as a partner that does outreach around these things, I'd love to have pre-created materials that I can share either through social media, on my website, at events, through like one of these flyers that they could scan, or even rack cards or something that we can give out about being, preparedness opportunities, and how people can learn more information. So anything that we can create that's like a media toolkit that can be shipped out to partners would be really helpful. That's really graphic oriented and centered.
Thank you, Alex. Nancy, go ahead.
So I don't know if you, by the way, great presentation before I get started with my questions. At one point, Thomas Rush came here and talked to us about how to communicate climate things last year. I don't know if you had an opportunity to talk with him at all about your communication strategy, but he did receive a bunch of feedback from us on how to communicate things related to climate. So I'm going to go over a few of them. One of which is that I'm not sure sending people to the Issaquah Insiders is the only way to do it, because a lot of people aren't on that list and not really knowing it. So you have a couple of tools that the city has to send out regularly. One is a utility bill. The second one is an annual water quality report the city has to send out. The third one is partnering with waste management on garbage. PSC is putting out a regular bill to most of us. Some get it electronically, but they can add to that too if you work with them in partnership. So my suggestion is for those of us that aren't as technology savvy, that wouldn't be me, but my husband, yes. I think it would really benefit to use other means than assuming that everybody's checking emails and on the Insider. We need to get it. The second piece that I would suggest I'm changing topics is we need to get to the chamber. We need to get to businesses as well as students and homeowners. So without them starting to do more, we're going to be way behind. We need to get to the Costco's and the big REIs and stuff and get their participation as well. The third thing that I was going to say along these lines, remember it, is that I really appreciate the storyboard, but we need to find a way to communicate it. And to me, the words climate vulnerability assessment means nothing. But if you talk about climate change, you see that in the news almost every day. You've got to start there. If you want information about climate change, one piece of it is the vulnerability assessment. So we need to get something that drags people to whatever website we're using to communicate this. And I'm not sure those 3 words, climate vulnerability assessment, is enough to draw me to go look and to search this storyboard. But if you talk to me about climate change and what is your community doing about it, I'd go follow that one because I'd be interested in it. So that's just my feedback to you. I think the name will be hard to get people to click the link and open it.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Nice. Do you have any questions?
I had a quick follow-up.
Sure.
I really appreciate that feedback. And I'm putting you on the spot by asking this question, but do you have an idea of what words would get you to pull the thread?
What is your city doing about climate change or
I just
climate
wanted
change
to
is a
make sure.
word that you've got to be using there, not vulnerability. I mean, it is part of what we're doing and it tells us how we're doing and where we're susceptible to problems, but we really need to get them because that's what people are trying to say. I'm buying heat pumps, I'm buying a green car. What else can I do? And so we need to help them with that. And I think there's not just the vulnerability assessment, but there's all of the other stuff we're trying to get them to do. We can get them hooked to look at this. We might be able to bring about more change.
Absolutely. I wanted to verify the words embedded within your feedback or things that would get you to go forward. Great. Thank you so much.
I think largely we're talking about threats to the community, right? How do we mitigate them? And so being able to powerful when we're trying to talk about, well, why are we talking about this? Why are we trying to get people to pay attention? And more importantly, what's the solution to it? One thing that I have a note here, as we mentioned, how can we get the community resources? And I think instead we should think about how are we going to give them resources, right? What do we find are solutions that are tangible that we, with our knowledge, can then hand out, right? Rather than making the citizens say, well, I don't know what to do. Instead say, hey, we think composting is a good idea. Here's an event where we're giving away composting beds, right? That's something that Issaquah has done, right? How can we actually get people resources rather than trying to say, where can we direct you? It's a slight shift of thinking, but it kind of puts the onus more on how are we trying to reach out within our community and actually enable them to be following through in an easier way. I think in a similar way, unfortunately, the factory model in education uses worksheets to teach kids and has made people pretty obsolete to them. When a kid sees a piece of paper, they're not generally even reading through that piece of paper. And so the idea that a flyer is going to filter down, probably pretty unlikely when you think about how many pieces of paper a kid sees every day right now in an ISD school district. And so instead, I parrot what other people have said, but I would rather see an involvement with the school district of where maybe high schoolers could be coming into a junior high and elementary environment. Kids feel powerful when they are the teachers, right? When they're learning something that they can then teach back. And it really reinforces the model of understanding critical thinking component to this rather than just being told it. And so I do wish that the education component flipped a little bit. We've seen it rather than doing a flyer. I think it's not going to get the intent that we want, but being able to teach a child something that they can teach somebody else, you're going to have that reverberation of them then having conversations later on in their family and knowing and saying, oh, I know this information rather than I've just been told this information. Further, we've done a lot of work on code with our signage. If you are able to break through and put tags on things, I will be the first to be so happy that you do. We've been advocating to the city to put QR codes on our parks boards, on signage throughout the city, and it's something that for some reason has not been able to be salient. A large portion of the Issaquah population has a smartphone, and the fact that we don't use QR codes on any signage that we use is pretty ridiculous. We've even talked about having safety issues, people trying to get public notices, pulling over to the side of the road to understand what's going on here. And instead, a quick snap QR code would avoid that. Doesn't happen. If you could figure out why and you can break through, that would be great. But it's a way that it should be communicated in every form, right? When you see a tsunami or a flooding threat or anything, there should be a QR code that can link you then to resources and further information to better understand what's going on. And I think that part of this is a perceived reality, right? We're trying to speak to a portion of the population that may not be in alignment or have the knowledge base to say, yes, I agree with all these things, right? So there is a component of needing to educate and to say this is actively happening and this is how we know it's happening to help kind of bring people around to have a better understanding of it. Maybe that's bringing in presenters and doing TED-style talks, right? At community centers or things like that. And I think there's an education component where we can communicate this information in a way that feels more collaborative with the community. And again, we've talked a lot about things like kiosks and the use of neighborhoods as focal points for being able to reach microcosms within the city. And so there's places like, for instance, the Highlands, right, where it would be easier to be able to post a tag, to post a flyer in community kiosks. And so examining where in our code do we allow this and being able to kind of push the administration to say we've allowed for this signage code, so let's actually enact it because we want to use this tool, and being able to kind of use the resources that we know we've built in but don't necessarily exist but can't. That makes sense. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing. I didn't see any mention of partnerships. And I wanted to pair it with someone else said, Snoqualmie Tribe, businesses, builders, to help with outreach, right? To better understand even builders can be a huge resource right now of saying like, why does this green space exist in this building, right? Being able to say, why is it that we have an infrastructure plan that we do because it contributes to clean water, clean air, right? Different things that we enacted into our code, we can better communicate why they exist in the built environment to the people.
And go ahead. Oh,
You're
we can't hear
muted.
you.
You're muted.
Sorry, I have two things to unmute, and so I have to remember that. Great conversation, great presentation. Just a short little thing to, and my idea might be too long, but loved what Nancy said about how to communicate and who to communicate with. I was just thinking maybe this would be a good way to draw people in. What is our city doing to keep us safe from the effects of climate change? But that might be too long, so I just wanted to toss that out there in case you like it.
I
That's
have a
it.
question. Oh, I had a question from staff, Jim. What does success look like from this? Like, what is the key message or messages that we think people need to come out of this communication about the climate vulnerability assessment? What do we want them to understand or know or react?
I think that what success looks like is preparedness as a sliver of resilience within the community and 100% coverage of all of the neighbors, including those who come from vulnerable populations, including our unhoused neighbors, immigrants, etc. And to track that is extremely hard. To have any kind of measurable, trackable follow-up would be extremely hard. But in so much as maybe we don't know we get 100% coverage, the attempt of 100% coverage is what success looks like for. I understand what the vulnerabilities are to my community, and I am prepared to meet each of those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I think you said that well. I was just gonna say, I think we want the community, all of the community, especially those most at risk, to understand the impacts. I think a lot of our community doesn't even think about wildfire, and that is a true risk now. And to know, to have access to the resources and know what they can do to be prepared and where they can go to be safe. And I think and I think with the communication materials, what Kathleen's been really careful about and what we will be going forward is not to create fear, but to just build that awareness and provide the resources that folks know what to do and what action they can take, and do it in a way that's not igniting fear, but instead just a self-sufficiency.
Does Issaquah put out a citywide survey annually?
We do every 2 years, do a community survey.
That might be a way to get a metric.
Yeah.
Along with some of the questions that Kathy mentioned, statements there, add those to the survey.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. We do have a couple of sustainability questions that are in that survey. I think with now the completion of the vulnerability assessment, it would be a good time to add that in, and that'll go out next year. Yeah, it's a great suggestion.
Yeah.
That's 2025.
2025, I believe. I think they did in 2023. It came out.
I haven't finished. So the reason I asked that question is because I think that like climate vulnerability assessment, how you communicate it to the public could take different forms. Like it's one, the city is doing something to understand these impacts. There's the people that this is going to most directly impact. This is how we're going to help you in this case. So I think we need to think about the different levels of communication we're going to have with this. Like there's some communities that are going to see direct impacts that we've identified in this report. We should be thinking about how do we communicate those risks and the solutions to them. And that seems like the base level, like we have to do that. That's like the number one priority coming out of this is the most at-risk groups. How are they aware of the risks that they're going to be facing and the resources that they have? I think more generally, and what our resources maybe feel more focused on right now is general education, which while it's important, that I'm not sure it's the right first step or the right priority for, based on what you're saying, that all of the most at-risk people, I mean, we want everyone to aware, but especially the most at-risk people. I don't see that in the current plan of like, this is how we're going to target the unhoused or whoever else we like go through the climate vulnerability assessment, who is most at risk based on the risk we've seen. How are we communicating to them? That would be the first thing that I would do. And then I think climate vulnerability, so I agree with Nancy that word and just that general framing isn't going to work for people. And even, I'm not even sure climate change is like, that's not going to resonate with everyone. So I think how we communicate this, and I don't have the answer, but is going to be really delicate. I think the one thing I know is that climate vulnerability assessment is probably not the right term, but how you communicate the risks that they're going to be facing. Because I think a lot of people are just going to be like, what's the punchline? What do I need to know? How is this going to impact me? And what are the resources that I have? So I think someone being able to get that information, and then if they want to dive deeper on like what the whys and what climate change impacts they're going to see and why those impacts are occurring, that's at least how I would think about it, is like the baseline. How do you communicate the facts, the impacts to them, and then give people options to educate? But it just seems like if there's too much packaging about climate change around this, that you might miss some of your audience that really need to hear about this. So I think that just general messaging and how you're getting in touch with the people most at risk are the two areas that seem like maybe more attention could be paid to. So, but yeah, overall, I think some of the other things are nice, but I'm not sure we've addressed the biggest potential risk populations, or at least identified who those are so we know that we're targeting them. Dixie.
This is like a really interesting thing to be thinking about. So I think it's probably important to really think about the goal. You guys kind of talked about that. But like in the flyer, for example, it actually, as I was reading, I was like, actually, I don't know that it's actually a bad thing, to be honest. If the assessment says we're in danger, then I don't know if we should sugarcoat it. I think we do that a lot in sustainability stuff. Like, some people don't really realize the threat is actually much closer than, they like to think, well, it's not going to happen in my lifetime. Well, that's probably not the way it is. So for whatever that's worth. I know we're talking about children, but you know, they're the ones that are gonna have to deal with this the most. So I think maybe it's important to be a little bit real with what the results say. And then the flyers, to the flyer point, it feels a little like, you know, here we're telling them to protect climate change and then we're printing things. So if we can avoid that, I think that maybe makes sense, right? To show that like here's what we believe in, and you know, here's some solutions. Although I do understand the purpose is to help reach people who maybe don't have access to phones and things like that. And then just a thought was, you know, when was it, in the 80s? Neighborhood watch groups were really popular at one point. Why not? I know it would be a very big undertaking, but why not start creating the idea that if we know where these challenged areas are going to be, you know, there's a lot of data available, and there's probably apps that would do the same thing of creating kind of like almost like a neighborhood tree, so that people start like realizing, like, because some people will be more in every community, there's always somebody who's really into it and some that aren't, and they can help kind of bridge the gap that I just don't think like a website does for the people we're trying to reach, which is the best way to reach them is say, hey neighbor, did you know that we are at risk for wildfire? And here's what we're going to do. Here's the plan. And we just want you to know what the plan is. Like, that's it's a big project, but a simple solution in some ways. So, and then I think social media is a great strategy. It's what everybody's using. And it can be a really easy strategy because you can literally make all of your posts. You can make 365 posts and just keep regurgitating them all the time. Just schedule them and they just keep posting. So at least it's out there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
See, Joy, we do need to wrap this topic, so if there's anything quick.
Quickly,
I can't do it longer.
quickly, I'll Tara, what Dixie is saying is that the best way you're going to reach vulnerable populations, again, I did not get that at all from the presentation, that was the priority target. The best way to do that is through word of mouth. And you asked, how do communities talk? And a way to do that is basically put park benches in places that we know people are picking up bus stops, being able to create spaces where people are talking, and then being able on those park benches, right, that are queuing, oh, hey, there's information about how many plastic bottles were used to make this bench, right? There's a lot of different ways that we can create spaces to enable more interaction and human interaction. We used to actually have people who worked for the city of Issaquah, who would be in every single neighborhood, would create these networks like the Watch. And the administration chose to do away with them. And we called for them many times to come back. And the best way to do it again is on a neighborhood level within Issaquah, and to be able to advocate for how do we rebuild that infrastructure that we actually already used to have, so that people are having direct dialogue with their neighbors about, hey, when there is flooding, here's the best way that we know to help this person who has maybe mobility issues, and this person who has these other challenges is the people who are living next door to them. And so that's really your goal. You need to, how are these people actually coming together and facilitating?
All right, I think that's all of our comments. Any final thoughts for us, Kathleen and Stacy?
No, I think we'll take the feedback, probably sit down with our communications team, emergency manager. And then as Kathleen mentioned, we are going to be talking with the Human Services Commission in a couple of weeks. And so we'll really focus that conversation on reaching, how do we best reach those populations.
Great. With that, we will move on to our next agenda topic, the 2022 greenhouse gas emissions inventory.
Jamie, real quick, sorry to interrupt. We did have 2 additional members of the public join. Is it okay if we check in whether they're interested? Okay. Hi, Ann Fletcher and Dave. Nice to see you. Just wanted to check in and see if you all were hoping to make public comment tonight or if you're just listening. If you are able to unmute. Okay, if you're having any trouble unmuting, please go ahead and send me a chat if you would like to make a public comment, or you can send me an email.
Well, it's nice to be back. I was gone for a few months, but from the board, but I'm thrilled to be back, and I'll be joining y'all moving forward. So tonight I get to join y'all to talk about the 2022 Greenhouse Gas Inventory Report. Throughout the presentation, I would say feel free to ask questions as we go. There's a lot of details, a lot of numbers, and a lot of really specific items that we can dig into. So recognizing we're going to cover a lot, feel free to ask questions as we go, and just flag my attention if I miss any questions. So the goal of the presentation today is to share the results of our 2022 community-wide and government operations greenhouse gas inventory, as well as to seek recommendations from the Environmental Board on how staff should best bring this material to City Council. We are scheduled to go before City Council in early February to present this information. And we would love some feedback and recommendations on focus and ways to best present this information. So as a quick background on greenhouse gas inventories, they're generally used to calculate, quantify, and assess community-associated and government-associated greenhouse gas emissions and their sources. They've been around for a long time. However, the methodology continues to change and evolve over time as we learn more about our emissions, as we learn more about how to track different sources of emissions and how to apply emissions to different communities. So they've been around for a little while. We have completed, we completed our 2022 greenhouse gas inventory to determine our current sources of greenhouse gas emissions as a point in time understanding of where our emissions are really coming from, as well as review some trends around where how we're doing compared to previous years around some of our emissions to help identify policies, programs, and actions that we can take to address our greenhouse gas emissions. So just kind of highlighting some items, knowing that we've done greenhouse gas inventories for a while, and these have been done across the international community, there are a few things that we knew going into this, right? We knew that some of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions come from our built environment, and they come from transportation. And you'll see through the results that that is what our emissions inventory has shown. So our inventory from 2022 provides us a lot of specific information that we can run with. But luckily, in a lot of ways, we're not starting from zero here, and we already have some programs in place, and we're already kind of thinking about how we can best address emissions from some of these sources. I also have a picture. There's emissions associated with our solid waste disposal. There's emissions associated with refrigerant use and losses of emissions from transporting energy from place to place. So there's a whole complex set of how we think about those emissions. We can go into any more detail on the specifics of how emissions inventories are done as necessary. So the 2022 greenhouse gas inventory process, we partnered with, we did this in partnership with the Eastside Climate Partnership, cities of Bellevue, Redmond, Kirkland, and Mercer Island. We wanted to do a regional inventory effort to make sure that each of our cities' inventories were aligned in their methodology, to make sure that we could work through this process together, and then also ideally to find efficiencies in scale. Working together, we could improve the process and hopefully reduce cost to doing these inventories for us at the city. We contracted with Cascadia Consulting between July and December 2023 to do this inventory. And Cascadia Consulting has done a lot of inventories, including the 2019 regional inventory for King County. The inventories were completed in compliance with ICLEI best practices for community-wide and government operations inventories, and ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability is a great organization that has some tools that can help you do the emissions calculations. and generally is well respected as a good standard for these emissions inventories. The results of the 2022 greenhouse gas inventory represent both the 5th community-wide greenhouse gas inventory that the city has done, as well as the first ever government operations inventory. And it directly associates with ICAP Action 2.1. I wrote completed on this, although this is, an ongoing process. We're going to be doing more greenhouse gas inventories as we move forward to continue to track where we're at and the impacts of our actions. So diving into the results, this is a pie chart of our community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. And what we can really see here in the orange, yellow, is that's the biggest source of our emissions, and that is our built environment. Then the purple is our transportation emissions. And these emissions are roughly in line with the percent of our emissions that come from the built environment and from transportation as our largest sources really is in line with previous inventories, 2019 and 17. Yeah.
Just a quick question. So this is Issaquah specific, or is it all the partnership specific?
So this is Issaquah specific. Yes. Yeah. So each city worked together to develop the inventories, but each city got their own inventory. So one of the benefits of that is that we can compare ourselves to our neighboring cities. And so we have the equivalent of 10.5 metric tons of carbon CO2 equivalent emissions per capita. And that is roughly in line with other cities. It's a little bit higher than a few cities and a little bit lower than others, but it's all roughly in that area. And again, our largest emission sources are from the built environment and transportation, with still a significant amount from refrigerants and landfill. And the refrigerants number has been increasing a little bit, I would note, and that might be from better tracking tools and better ability to measure that. So there's a little bit of, we still need to be diving into that a little bit more. But again, this does highlight that our focus is really on that electricity, that natural gas, and vehicles as well.
So there's a few questions here. So the program which was used by Cascadia Consulting, ICLI, right? So is that a standard industry practice nationally, or is it more local?
Yeah, so ICLI is an organization that has this tool called ClearPath. And right. ClearPath is a national and I think even internationally used tool.
Right, I think CDP has produced it. Okay.
See, I'm not familiar with CDP, okay. But it is it's a generally accepted tool internationally to do a lot of these greenhouse gas inventories.
And so for this particular analysis, right, I'm guessing you just provided them the raw data or whatever numbers you had, and then they played with it essentially, right? And then they gave you this analysis. So is there a margin of error, or, like how accurate is the data? I mean, this looks great. The
Excellent
goals are pretty impressive, trying to cut down 50%. And this is good. And I'm pretty sure we are making an effort. But when I look at this chart, I always wonder, what is really the margin of error or accuracy of the data?
Yeah, so I would say, so the way Cascadia was able to do this, we actually only really provided the municipal operations, the government operations data. The community-wide data, Cascadia Consulting used a number of different tools and methods that are created at national, regional, local levels. So for instance, for electricity data, they were able to go to PSC and get information on the emission sources or the carbon intensity of the electricity of Puget Sound Energy's electric mix. They were able to get an understanding of how much natural gas is actually going to the different communities. When you get to things like on-road vehicles, public transit, those are more, there are a number of different models that can help a city or a region understand what the emissions are. So for our vehicles, on-road vehicles, Cascade used the Puget Sound Regional Council model, which is built off of a number of different models and inputs that go into that kind of spits out a vehicle miles traveled amount for our city. So some of the data is a little bit more specific than others, and some of the data, there's a number of these different models that have been put together and vetted and tried and in many iterations to kind of figure out what's the best way to measure some of this. And that's kind of one of the items that I alluded to with methodology changing, right? So, you know, the PSRC, Puget Sound Regional Council VMT model is the best model we currently have, but that model could be improved as time goes on, as we figure out how to better track vehicle emissions, right? So those methods will continue to change as we figure that out. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, thanks.
And we do have Anne question.
Wonderful.
Hey, thanks. Great work, David. And so I also am wondering how they got the vehicle miles traveled data. And it's just for people living in Issaquah, correct? Not people who drive through?
I believe it actually does include folks who come through on I-90 and come through the city. So those are emissions within the city of Issaquah.
I see. Okay.
And I will confirm that, but I believe that's the case.
So maybe they're counting vehicles over a certain period of time then as they go through?
That include the emissions associated with the vehicle miles traveled that come through the city of Issaquah, or that occur within the city of
I
Issaquah.
think Anne's asking, is there a direct measurement or is it all based on the model?
Oh, I apologize. Yes, so it's all based on, for the community-wide, it is all based on the model. As we get to, you know, our own government operations inventory, you'll see we have specific numbers there, but this is all based on the model.
Cool. And so I know this is not the full report, and it would be kind of fun to see the full report. Is that something that you guys are allowed to share out, or is it confidential?
It is not confidential. Attached to the board packet, I believe, was the report that we've developed so far. So we can continue to build on that as we would like. But that report does include the data that we have.
Okay, cool. I must have missed that link. Awesome. Thank you so much.
I can make sure that you have it at the end of this meeting.
Cool. And I have one more thing to say, but I can wait until we get to that part if that works better.
Sure.
I have something going. If you think it's a little bit, like, because we're not basing anything on direct measurement, I'm guessing not only for VMT, but also for the, like, the carbon intensity of those miles traveled. Is that also based on a model?
I believe that also goes into the model. There's generally
into the model, or is it using output?
My understanding is that the output from the model helps understand vehicle miles traveled, and then in the entry into ClearPath, they use percent understandings of different types of vehicles that are on the road and carbon intensities of
Is that general?
vehicle miles.
Is that general, like, types of vehicles, or how are they for Issaquah versus Kirkland? Is there any differentiate? Are they just using the same assumptions within the communities?
I believe it's regional here for Issaquah. There is a specific model that's more specific for Kirkland, Bellevue, and Redmond. So for those three cities, Cascadia was able to use a much more specific model. Ours is more regional.
Yeah, I guess my concern here is that VMT, anything that's based on a model, our actual behavior change won't necessarily be captured by that model, because like we're not directly measuring difference in vehicle miles traveled, is my understanding of the methodology here. So if Issaquah does something different than Kirkland, that does something different than Redmond, we're all just kind of getting averaged into the same model. So it's very difficult to discern like what actual changes are occurring, because you're only a basis in a model and no direct measurement. means that you can't actually tell whether there's been a change. So that's one of my concerns. I think the other, similarly on the types of vehicles, like a great example being like, if we can successfully drive adoption of EVs, is that going to be factored into future updates? Because it doesn't seem like our actual Issaquah specific vehicle mix has been directly measured and applied into the model. So I'm just worried that like some of the biggest inputs for the model or for our pie chart here aren't actually being directly measured and like are going to be difficult to actually show whether we're making progress against because they're all model based. So I think that's maybe separate from the results here, but that's one concern based on how this is being described. And I don't know if on the electricity, natural gas, are we using actual usage for within the city?
I believe PSC did provide actual usage for broken out by cities. Yeah.
Okay. So it seems like that on-road vehicles is the main section that has kind of an indirect measurement. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. I do think that feels like it's going to be difficult to measure change or like how Issaquah might perform versus others. So
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that is something that I can get more detail on that specific Puget Sound Regional Council model to provide if that's helpful. And then also just thinking about, moving forward as we address this, my hope would be we develop better models and systems for being able to better actually understand what's happening more locally. This is fairly regional, so or this is fairly localized to the region, so it does reflect pretty well what's actually going on here in Issaquah, since yes, we're doing things a little different than our neighboring cities, but EV adoption in Issaquah is not going to be dramatically different than our neighboring cities, for instance. So I would say I have okay confidence in that model for where we're at least in the methodology.
I'm gonna build on what Jamie's saying. So the only thing we really have control over that we can show that we're making a difference is our electricity and natural gas. Because we're rolled in on the vehicle piece with other communities and it's not actually measuring trucks driving through here and other things. And so really the only greenhouse emissions that we can potentially show in the community that we are improving on is our built environment use. Not necessarily the vehicles, because we're averaged, we're in with everyone else. And I guess my comment is that really needs to show up in the presentation as a specific item or a specific slide. Because I suspect that if we measure this in 5 years, our vehicle use won't change much because we're in an average with other communities. So we really should be tracking what we're doing on electricity and natural gas.
Understood.
Just a suggestion to add another slide to at least clarify that so people see that.
Yeah, I can look to do that. And I would clarify that the vehicle model is specific to Issaquah, or the model is a regional model. The numbers here are specific for Issaquah based on geography and what the vehicle miles are within our geography.
Like how many are EVs and how many of them are gas powered? I don't think you're seeing that.
You made it to your first traffic.
Yes.
And you get all these questions. I would encourage you to understand the model in detail and be prepared to explain it up front. You might even want to have a slide right off the get-go that here's the model, here's how it works, here's the region that it looks at, here's how they analyze things. If you put this in our house, we're gonna get the same questions. You're hearing here, they're gonna tear this down until they understand the model behind this. And then like the vehicles, for instance, I mean, I'm really curious how much of that 37% is I-90 versus the vehicles that are running around in town. What can we change? What is affected out there? And then even on the electricity and natural gas, I'm not convinced that is specific for Issaquah. I think that's an average from PSC on average kilowatts used times the number of homes, or times the number. I don't know. I really want to better understand. Sure.
Maybe just one more comment. Also, the refrigerants data also here might be kind of generic because I'm guessing they might have just calculated, the input and output based on the refrigeration model, assuming, in each household or something. That's just my guess based on the GHG accounting, which I have done previously, unless you have specific data for the refrigerator for each household, beginning versus the end period. You can use the type of the refrigerator you have and you basically spit out based on the model what the numbers are. So they might not be accurate as well. To Anne's comment, I did look at the report which was attached with the email, and I was curious to see actually the raw data. And again, if you are able to share it with us, I was just curious how the model was handling the raw data. And I didn't see any raw data, means I did see some tables and charts, but again, this is what I was also interested. So if you can share it, and if you don't have time, if you can just share it in email, if it's possible,
Sure.
I just would like to look at it as well.
Yeah, as we have time at the end, I'm happy. I have a number of different data.
And not
pieces
just
up.
today, I'm just asking if whenever, if you are okay to share it, I would like to look.
Sure.
On the note of what Dawn was saying, I do think one thing to think about is this the right first slide? Like, so the next slide, or maybe it's 2 slides from now, like, I think the punchline of like where are emissions going might be the right first slide. And then I do like one of the things that I struggle with all of the slides put together is like, and I sent you a few notes on this. It's just like, how are we doing and where are we seeing changes? And I think what Dawn mentioned around how is that in the addressable portion of emissions versus the not addressable part is really what I like. In my mind, the progression is what are overall emissions doing? What are the categories there? Within those categories, what's addressable? Then what is the trend in the addressable emissions within those categories? Because I think based on some of your responses, which were very helpful, it seems like Issaquah impacted direct emissions are not where the decrease is coming from. Most of the decrease is coming from changes in PSEs, the carbon intensity of the electricity mix. So that would be that to me is really, really important to understand that all of the decrease we're seeing, or a very large portion of the decrease we're seeing, is related to PSE changes. We're still, and of course, this is basically we didn't have a ICAP for most of the lead up to this, so wouldn't expect it necessarily. But I think that's a good, that's a baseline that people need to understand. That's the punchline that I think people need to understand. It's really hard to get out of the current presentation. So those are some ideas on how you might structure this differently. And I know the addressable part is probably might not have been a part of how Cascadia approached this. I do think it's an important consideration as we think about the update of ICAP as well. We ultimately need to be able to, the most important thing we can do is measure the things that we can actually impact. Obviously we want to know the overall story, but how are we doing on the things that we can actually impact? And there's some way it might be already in what they've done to pull that out and kind of give some light to that. That would be super, super helpful. Because I think right now it's good that emissions went down, but it's challenging to understand the why and the how are we doing question, as it relates to what we're trying to do here, which is reduce within Issaquah's controllable things. What can the community do to decrease emissions?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can do to dig more into the methodology and models and share that information. I just do want the board to think about that the greenhouse gas inventories, they're not an exact science. They're based on what is available at the time. We were getting data up till, we're still waiting on a little bit of data. It takes a long time for some of that data to be generated. And as David presents in the materials, and we'll talk about more, they're also based on the best methodology at the time. Those methodologies continue to improve. And so it's really meant to be kind of a snapshot in time of where are we. with all those assumptions and the best available information at the time. And so really looking at those trends, coming away with that punchline, how have we changed since the last few years? And does that direct us to maybe take some different action? But just thinking of that as kind of that snapshot in time, definitely not an exact science. So just encourage you all to think of it in that way. I just did want to mention too, we talked with someone today that does inventories using different models for some of these factors. And while there were some slight differences, for the most part in alignment with the findings of this inventory. So that was a good kind of gut check that this is at least on the right track. So just.
I do also think it is valuable to point out that this is really looking at what is our emissions community-wide. And I believe in a comment that Anne had emailed in, right? Addressing these emissions is that patchwork of state efforts, Clean Energy Transformation Act and Climate Commitment Act, which there's some threats to this year. It's that federal action and it's that local action, right? So this is mainly just looking at where are we at here in the community? And this is also recognizing that to address all of these emissions, there's a lot that the city can do, and there's a lot that the city can't do to address some of these emissions, and it is going to be that big effort, right?
Two other quick thoughts. One, since a lot of this is based on, which I totally understand, there's limits on what can be done, and like there's going to have to be some reliance on the model. One great thing about a model is when you change inputs in a model, what those outputs are. And so something that I would be really interested in Cascadia, like creating, or basically an output of this being, is like, if you change mix of vehicles by this, like basically what are the things that would really move the needle? Like that seems like an output that could come from their model, from these different areas. Like, are there ways that we can understand if X residents switch to this, like this much impact would result? Like those types of things would be really helpful to like it's these big, huge numbers, like what can actually change? Like what are the things that will actually move the needle? That would be super, super helpful to kind of, I don't think necessarily for the community, for the council, but for the community would really help to start like drive home how can they actually make meaningful impacts on this. And then I don't remember what was one other thing, maybe it'll come back to me. Yeah, oh, maybe I'll.
We got a lot of slides to cover, so don't worry.
Please respond to that first suggestion. I don't think that's going to be part of the work they're doing with this, but we are in discussions with consultants about, as a next phase, doing somewhat of an economic analysis, is what is the local investment and on what actions needed to move the needle, given the state and federal policies that are in place. So I think it's somewhat at your question. So we're hoping to do that this spring in time for all the city budget updates and requests. So I'll let you know if that moves forward, and it'd be a great discussion.
Oh, I don't know if this was it, but this was maybe a different thing. One thing that isn't in the presentation currently that would be helpful is 2017, 2019, 2022, all in relation to our ICAP goals, and that graph that we have in ICAP, just to see like, it's still early, but like, where are we within that context? Sure.
But if you're talking about that, you should also talk about growth in the community, like how much growth has happened between 2017, 2019, and 2022, both business and it's not just in the city, but it's also in the region, because we know many of the facilities, people in South King County can use Issaquah's stores right through.
Yeah,
I think that's missing from this presentation overall is popular. It hasn't been stagnant.
Yes, and I think that gets to a challenge I had, and this is very good feedback, and thinking about, out of all of the data that I could present, what is the good pieces to bring out, right? So for instance, in moving ahead, right? So this is our inventory 2017 through 2022. Looking at some of those trends. The reason I'm showing 2017, 2019, and 2022 is because these are the 3 inventory years that use the same methodology. One of the things that you can notice from this is it does go down. It's a 17% well, that's the next slide, but it's a 17% per capita reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and a 10% overall reduction. And one of the, when you look at the specific data that comes out of a lot of this, the therms of natural gas use, the kilowatt hours for electricity actually stays fairly similar between those 3 years. And the per capita amount does decrease a little bit, right? So even though the emissions then aren't going down by leaps and bounds, the per capita emissions is improving a little bit better than overall emissions. However, the biggest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over this 5-year time do come from reductions in the carbon intent or improvements in the carbon intensity of the PSE electric grid. So when you see where these improvements are coming from, it's reductions in emissions from commercial electricity use, residential electricity use, and industrial electric use.
Is that from better technology? Is that what you've done?
I believe it's from changing out their fuel sources.
So, David, another thing isn't COVID should be one of the things which should reduce the GHGs, emissions in this, means this graph has to be moved because of the COVID, right? Means, or have you considered, or is there a consideration of COVID data, because of the how much the GHG emissions were reduced or anything? I'm guessing it's not considered. This is just the bulk data used to produce this graph. Is that right?
So this data shows the data from the greenhouse gas inventory years we conducted. And so 2019 and 2022 kind of are the ones that bookmark around COVID. I think one way that COVID does show up in this graph is there is a raw reduction in vehicle miles traveled based on the models or the city of Issaquah in 2022. My understanding, and in talking with folks who've been doing these inventories nationally, that is expected to actually, that reduction might be leftover impacts from COVID-19. And while there are still folks working from home and that has changed, it wouldn't be surprising when we do the next greenhouse gas inventory to actually see an increase in VMT again as people continue to drive out in the world, right? So I think that's a good example of where we can make an assumption within the data that the reduction in VMT is probably from COVID still.
And just to let you know, means I think you guys are doing awesome. This is a great, effort. And just to add, even though you are getting so many questions on what we are asking, I know how complicated the GHG accounting gets. As Stacy put it, it's not just that it's not science. You are trying to do a quantitative assessment by using some qualitative data in a lot of circumstances where there are assumptions. So, you do it the best you can and try to get to the quantitative side. And that's where, I'm saying the margin of error or your assumptions, that language needs to be put somewhere, or it needs to be clear on your graphs or the reports. You might be able to get a better language on that from Cascadia Consulting themselves when they are using the model, which would be worth putting somewhere in the report, because this is a huge undertaking. And I can say that from personal experience. I've done it on smaller scale, and based on the model you use or the type of tool you use, you can get different results, or based on the data or the assumptions, slight change can make a difference. So, there is a lot of margin of error if there is a slight change. So you need to have that specified somewhere in the report. That's just me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I can reach out to Cascadia to see if they have a specific margin of error.
And actually you're getting so many questions as well, because, it's not an exact science, or it's not just quantitative data.
No, and we anticipated lots of questions. This is a very complex topic, and we know it's of high interest. So
thank you.
Definitely was expecting many questions here.
Just a quick note on that.
Yes.
Getting back to, I think Dawn focuses really well on what would the feedback be for you for next steps. I do think the statement of facts of what is the content, before the slides of what the graphs are doing, this not only the model, but also some of the context you're providing to us now around the impacts of COVID, the electrical grid changes, all of that as a like as context going into when someone sees numbers. Because as soon as people see numbers, their eyes go, brains go red, everything. So I think the more you can do to set the stage of like, what is the context here before you show even any specific numbers? What is the context? Population of Issaquah went up by X. This is an impact. The impact of COVID on driving is this amount of like, not, you don't have to quantify it, but like this is an impact. What are those things that like someone coming into this cold needs as context would be maybe the first slide, like or one of the earlier slides before any specific numbers. The recommendation. Dixie, go ahead.
I have a clarifying question.
Yes.
And maybe it's in here. I'm looking at it again to see if I missed it, but you're presenting data.
Mhm.
But what are we trying to get the council to do with this data? And I think maybe that is also a good place. Like if I'm presenting new information to people that I haven't given information to, I like to start with, okay, what am I hoping that they, because I think we have an agenda, obviously. So we want them to go with our agenda. You know, and so what does that look like in presenting the data so that they're led to go, wow, this is important and we need to do, I guess, and maybe it's in here, like I said, I may have missed it, but like what is the goal of the presentation to the council?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would probably say the goal for the presentation to council is really to, one, give them a just raw, what is the update on our community-wide and then our government operations greenhouse gas inventory, right? As we're thinking about implementing our ICAP, our functional plan there, that's kind of data that council needs to see. I think the other piece of this, and this comes out a little bit later on in the presentation, is where do we then focus our efforts at the city, right? And I think one of the pieces that this inventory results really highlights is that the focus to reach our ICAP targets and our ICAP goals, we really need to continue to focus and maybe prioritize focus within reducing emissions from our built environment and then from transportation, our two largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions if we want any hope of reaching those targets, right? And so I think that's a good method of thinking about what is it going to really take for us to get these emissions reductions, and then where are we going to have to focus at the city?
Just one quick question. And did you? I saw you had your hand raised. Did you have something to say, or it doesn't look like it's up now? But
I think. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I think David and Dixie addressed what I was going to say, which is basically we want the city council to continue to support our climate change efforts. And so possibly we need to amp up our communication on the solutions and how we will need, these are what we can do to get to a better report next time, because we clearly need to continue to do better. And we're going to need support from city council, and maybe it would be helpful for them if we can before the report, before February, to enumerate where we might need some funds.
Understood. And no, just one quick point that might be interesting. Might be able to capture in the vehicle emissions. I'm curious how much, there's a slight reduction there between 17 and 22.
Yep.
I'm curious how much of that is the sale of EVs. Because in 17 EVs weren't quite as prevalent as they are now. And I think you might be able to dig that information up in a regional-wide percentage of EVs being sold and kind of extrapolate that.
Yeah, I can definitely look that number up. I don't think that that is probably
good news fact to throw in.
Yeah, that would be something that could be helpful to be able to frame the conversation. Any other questions on community-wide trends, because the next switch is going to be on government operations inventory.
Yeah, I do have one of that.
Yes.
One thing that I would love to hear included in this is how this data will be tied back to the ICAP update. One frustration I've had with ICAP overall since inception is the lack of specific numbers other than our overall targets, but a lot of the goals don't get into the specifics of what our goal is for savings. And so I think one of the things that if I was council, I'd love to hear is, okay, we know these are the numbers. What we're now going to do is translate them into, like, apply these into our update to ICAP to understand, okay, we now know where we need to get these things we think are going to do this amount. I've seen other climate action plans that are much more specific on expected emission reductions. And so I just think that this is a good opportunity because we're also doing that update this year to begin that conversation. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I think if I was council, I would appreciate it if we went another step of talking about, okay, how are we going to then now use this data to inform what we're doing?
So I think on that point and 10, 15 slides down the line, I mentioned the ICAP update and midpoint check-in process. So just as a clarification, this year is the midpoint check-in on the ICAP, and the actual midpoint or the actual ICAP update won't happen until 2025, 2026 year. So one interesting note on that is if we were able to do another greenhouse gas inventory in 2024, which is the hope, would have even more data to then bring into that actual update process in 2025 and 2026. So that is good news, hopefully. The other piece is for some of these inventories, there's the idea of the wedge analysis, right? Thinking about what are the different actions that are going to take to reduce emissions and kind of over that time span between now and 2025, 2050, for instance, how do we want emissions to look like to get to those targets? And generally it was decided among the East Side cities that participated in this effort to not do the wedge for this update and probably do that in future updates. But the general idea was that, which is I think roughly what your point was getting at. I think generally the idea was that we have a wedge analysis from 2019 as part of the regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory conducted by PSREA, and that doing that updated wedge analysis was going to be a costly addition to this and wouldn't necessarily tell us a whole lot new, but that if we were to save it doing that for later, this would help us get that snapshot in time to continue to be able to focus and say, hey, look, the built environment and transportation are still our biggest sources of emissions. And emissions reduction is really driven by the utility. And here's what we can do to fit into this patchwork of efforts to meet our goals. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I think, no, I think it does. My point was a bit broader, just in as we think about how numbers come to life in the ICAP planning in general.
Mm-hmm.
I think looking back, and this was feedback that myself and others had when we originally passed ICAP, was that there wasn't enough specific, there weren't enough specific goals. And I think the right time to start having that conversation, whether we're not going to make that level of update at this midpoint update, and it's only in 2025, I still think that's a conversation we should start having. So that it was a broader point, I think.
Sure.
I think the wedge analysis is a great tool as part of that. So,
and I think
it's part of general conversation. I think it would be helpful to start having.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. So, what do you think about saving money and time and having our next analysis be in 2026? Because in 2026, we will have coal out of our mix. And so our electrical greenhouse gas emissions will potentially come way down.
Mm-hmm.
And And in between now and then, I think we know what we need to work on. It seems clear. And that could that open up some more time and energy and money to work on the real solutions that we know we need to work on?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, thinking about just the cadence of these greenhouse gas emissions inventories. I think the model, the East Side City partnership was moving towards is looking at doing those every 2 years roughly. Bellevue does them every single year because that's a request by their city council. We kind of felt like that wasn't necessary. You know, the emissions changes on a year-to-year basis aren't necessarily that large, and they don't often change direction of what efforts we want to do. So I think, you know, whether we do it in 2024 or 2026, that's something that we can absolutely consider, is kind of what is the correct cadence for us to be doing these inventories. Luckily, in partnering with the East Side cities, and this was kind of our first year doing this in part, the greenhouse gas inventory in partnership with them. Hopefully the burden becomes less. The effort actually becomes less to do this on a year-to-year basis, since we have kind of this ongoing partnership and contract with Cascada to be doing it. So in theory, we should be able to do these with less effort and investment from the city.
Cool. Do you know what the cost is?
We just got, yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, our portion was about 14,000, and that was for both of the inventories, as well as they did update the 2017 inventory with the new methodology that was applied in the most recent one.
Cool. So the next one, the price maybe go down, but still like $10,000 or $14,000. Like we think about that, like, oh, where else could that be spent that could actually help us reduce our emissions? Just a thought.
Yeah, no, it's great suggestion. I think most of the cities would prefer to do these less frequently. I think we're trying to figure out what the right timeline is for us.
Yeah, and that's $14,000 plus all the time that you guys spend on it.
I think the risk there is if the update of ICAP is in 2025 and anything out of the inventory is important to how we set goals, how we understand where we need to get, that 14,000 actually sounds quite small. And it's how we're allocating hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to invest in a plan. So I would just caution us that we make sure that that's the right, like $14,000 is actually much lower than I was expecting here. And that especially if we're talking about a plan that's going to last like a longer term plan, I would be concerned if this was, maybe we said, hey, this emissions analysis isn't important for that. That would be one thing, but if this is going to be an important resource for that, that would be a concern, I think. So,
well, just remember 2026 is only 2 years away.
Correct. Yeah, the cadence and the timing when we're receiving the reports now is also right ahead of our budget cycle. So that's, I think David did mention that, and this will feed into our conversation with council about the ICAP midpoint check-in. We have the results now for budget justification. So we would also have that next version of the inventory ahead of the 27, 28 budget. So
I would continue on 2-year cycle. It keeps your trend going. And if you're getting a 2024 evaluation, you're not going to get the results.
Yes. Or late 2025.
Yeah.
2026.
But yeah, great consideration. And
jumping into municipal operations. So this is our very first government operations greenhouse gas inventory. This is much more based on specific data we have, right? So we were able to get from Puget Sound Energy how much electricity we used for our government operations in 2022. We were able to run a report with our fleet team and figure out how much gasoline did we use for all of our vehicles, right? We were able to input specifically our specific electric vehicle mix for 2022, which was just one Nissan Leaf, so that didn't have a huge impact. We have that reflected in here. Overall, the government operations inventory represents roughly 1% of our community-wide emissions. The emissions per full-time employee is roughly on par again with our regional partner cities. We're again right in the middle between Bellevue, Kirkland, Redmond, and Mercer Island. There are a number of different things to note about this inventory. So for one, the electricity that's reported here, electricity consumption here, is not fully representative of all the electricity consumed at the city, because 79% of that municipal electricity is on the Green Direct program, which is a direct match for match kilowatt of electricity use here at the city with renewable sources in Western Washington. There's a wind facility and a solar facility that specifically relate to that. And through long conversations with Cascadia Consulting and Puget Sound Energy, the decision was that this Green Direct program was a good match for a good match of electricity use here with the renewable energy development in that we subscribe to. So this is actually the first government operations inventory that Cascadia has reflected government electricity in this way. So that's important to note, and we are in conversations with Puget Sound Energy about how we can address the rest of our electricity with similar green purchasing programs.
They're buying electricity from PSC while investing into their green generation system.
Yeah, so there's a specific program called Green Direct, which is what 79% of our municipal electricity is on. And essentially we pay a premium on some of our electricity. The reason it's not 100% is because we have changed our service levels over the years, and that's kind of put some of our accounts out, etc. But when we purchase into it, they developed a solar facility in Lund and then a wind facility in Skookumchuck, Washington. And basically they opened this program up to mainly municipal customers and public customers. And we could buy essentially a certain number of shares and connect a certain number of our accounts with the expected electricity generation of those renewable facilities. So we're essentially saying that the electricity consumed here at the city on the accounts that are on the Green Direct program, that electricity is coming from those renewable systems, even though it's not, 1-for-1 electrons, but it is that electricity is only getting accounted for our city accounts and not being included in PSC's, greenhouse gas inventory or, on their general grid, how clean their grid is, etc. Does that help?
We get
explain
a
it?
certification for those credits, so there's
Yes.
the document that they're not double.
I consider, because I think that's different than the residential, like green power and
It
solar
is.
choice.
Yeah.
That's like, I had assumed it was that. This is actually better than what
Yes.
you might just mention that, because I think that's better than, most people won't know that that's his.
Yeah, so this is one, I think, just like little details here, right? The Green Direct program is better than the Green Power program. The Green Direct program is fully subscribed. So if we were to transition additional electric accounts onto green purchasing programs, it would be the general commercial Green Power program, which is not as good in that it's not as local renewable energy generation. And the Green Direct program is fully subscribed and they're not planning on currently expanding it. So we can't put more accounts on it, unfortunately. However, we're exploring what other options look like.
So I'm kind of changing subjects. So we're done with that last one, just to make sure before I kind of move on to a different thought process.
Sure.
I'm looking at your final bullet on this page.
Yeah,
And I know the city did some construction projects. They hired outside contractors for, such as a water pipeline up on the hillside up here and stuff like that. Are those included in this or are they excluded? Because that's city money.
mhm. That's a good question. I believe they're excluded from this.
You might want to note that in your discussion, that city capital projects are not included in this.
Yeah.
Inventory.
Yeah, so this is specifically vehicle miles traveled and emissions associated with city owns.
I just think that should be clear because our operations does include projects that we're paying for.
Good clarification. I think one of the other things I want to point out here is that, you know, natural gas is a little over a quarter of our government operations emissions. Most of that comes from 3 buildings, right? The pool, the public works complex, and then the community center, right? And so one of the other topics that we brought before the board before was our municipal building municipal building decarbonization assessment, excuse me. And so there are going to be different programs that are specifically looking at how can we take that natural gas use out of our facilities, right? And we're currently moving forward with a number of different projects that hopefully are going to help reduce this number. Our largest emissions within transportation, our fleet do come from law enforcement vehicles, and then the utility and construction maintenance vehicles are our kind of second tier there. And then the other one I want to point out is this challenge of employee commute, which is a whole quarter of our government operations emissions, right? And that is going to be a hard nut to crack as we think about the different ways that we can reduce those emissions. We do have the commute trip reduction program. We've got teleworking. We have public transit, et cetera. But when we think about where our municipal programs can best address our emissions, it's most likely going to be, again, in that built environment and transportation space. So electricity, natural gas, and then the on-road fleet. And we have a number of different projects and efforts specific to that. Yeah.
On page 52, when we talked about the commute trip reduction, I do think there should be a mention of remote work and flexible work schedules.
Okay.
It's my understanding from over the years that each department operates differently and have their own culture of how they address it. And what really needs to happen is a shift in the administration to promote the things that we know will actually bring these numbers down. Right now, there is not a blanket approval for remote work for a lot of employees, right? It's depending on which department you're in. It's depending upon how our city administrator has decided that he thinks it should be, rather than having a blanket statement of saying this is something we support in this community and we support for our workers, right? Being able to have flexible hours when they're coming in and out also helps with how much pollution they're having rather than idle in, right? There's a lot of different things that we can do. And there's a culture shift that I think needs to be addressed. And it kind of goes back to the things I've been talking about as to what are we trying to advocate for with these numbers? It's something that I had coming up time and time again was, well, where do we want to go? And where do we expect this needle to fall? And part of that isn't just, it's part of it too, is a culture that we need to be saying we need to be doing this differently and we can do this differently. And I didn't really get that from this presentation of where do we go? What are we hoping to do? And this is a tangible example of something where we can say we need to have remote work and flexible work options for all, right? I think that would.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think one positive is that we did get preliminary numbers back in December, and some of these employee commute percent numbers were shared with the city administrator and helped inform the continuation of the policy to allow remote work for 4 out of the 5 days of the week. So in that way, it has had some tangible impacts already, which is really wonderful.
So that's, just to be clear, that 25% is obviously not everyone sticks to the policy. But
so that Stacy might have more information on the policy specific, but there are definitely departments especially ones where folks have to come in to the office to do their job. So there's definitely the variety of
Yeah.
folks.
Yeah, if you work at the permits desk, it's hard to.
Right.
Be remote.
Correct.
Manager, the
Your coffee.
department, right, there are places to.
Absolutely.
to promote, departments having
Yeah.
more harmonious culture, right? And right now it's very peaceful.
Yeah, we have a free charging policy for staff right now, a pilot program too. But I think one thing to consider is we can address our buildings, we can address our fleet. This employee commute may become 90% of our emissions over time. I mean, we'll see the numbers shrink, but that percentage of it, because we have less control on which vehicles employees are purchasing or where they're hired from, where they're traveling from. We'll definitely be promoting the public transit and all those things, but just know it's just a percentage of our total emissions. And we hope to shrink our buildings and fleet significantly. So something's going to have to grow in the pie.
Well, I mean, we can use lobbying efforts to advocate for civil servants getting specific subsidies, right? I mean, there's different things that we can do to help promote portions of our population having better access to buying an electric.
Absolutely. Yep.
There's other things we can do within our tools, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. We want to see our government operations reduced, just noting that we're going to see some shifts in this pie as we do, if we eliminate essentially that 21% of electricity because we're able to buy green power, that number will shrink. Somewhere else on the pie is going to have to grow as a percentage of our emissions.
Some quick questions, right? Your electricity and natural gas, that includes all city facilities?
Yes.
Then where is your equipment? Where's your off-road fleet?
Off-road fleet, it's that
Vehicles that they run around.
So that
trailers, the weed
under
eaters,
1% there's a,
Other sources.
no, it actually says off-road fleet underneath on-road fleet.
Oh, I missed that, sorry.
Yeah, it's a very small number. So potentially this would be a slide to bring farther up as we talk to council, but this is specifically noting different programs, incentives, policies, both that we at the city are pursuing as well as, or actively working on, as well at the state level that will help us get to specific sources of emissions, right? So Energy Smart East Side is a community-wide emissions that will help reduce the natural gas consumption in our community while increasing electricity consumption. The Clean Buildings Incentive Program, again, similarly will help both reduce electric consumption through energy efficiency, as well as reducing natural gas through the decarbonization and electrification of mainly large but other commercial facilities. Then there are a number of different state efforts, right? So the Washington Building Standards, which are going to help address emissions from new buildings. There's the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which will help address emissions from our electricity sector as that is going to go down. One that we didn't have on here is Title 18 and thinking about how we build addressed our land use patterns to build a more walkable, bikeable Issaquah that will hopefully help reduce our transportation emissions. And again, down the line, thinking about when light rail gets to the city, hopefully that'll have an impact again on some emissions. Thinking about our government sources, Green Direct is specifically focused at that government electricity greenhouse gas emissions, the municipal building decarbonization efforts, which includes both the feasibility analysis, the energy audits, and specific projects. That's going to help reduce that fossil fuel natural gas portion of the government operations. Thinking about our own efforts within the city to transition our fleet of vehicles to electric vehicles and build out the infrastructure to support that. And then again, the commute trip reduction program, which was mentioned before, and I know is going to get more attention, I believe, this year as well. So this is to just highlight a few of the different projects and efforts that are all focused on different pieces of those graphs and different pieces of our emissions sources. And You have a question?
Thanks, David. Yes, I think this is what I was addressing earlier. What do you think about adding some more solutions that we're going to need financial support approved by the city council for in this area?
Yeah, I think that's a great recommendation and something that we can definitely include. I think when it comes to specific numbers that we can make assumptions on really financially what's it gonna take to decarbonize, for instance, our own municipal buildings or electrify our fleet. And that's a lot of what we're gonna be learning this spring through a number of different analyses, right? And then we can also talk about how to address those emissions community-wide. When we think about where the city can fit into that, we can mention the need for continued investment and engagement in a number of the different programs that already exist, but also think about where else the city can kind of plug into the patchwork of efforts to help bring those numbers down. So I think that's a great suggestion.
Great, thanks.
So I know we're getting close to the end of the meeting. So I think kind of some overall analysis. One of the takeaways is that we are making significant progress towards some of our ICAP goals, and we're not making a lot of progress in other ICAP goals, right? And so there is going to be we have to continue to invest in our efforts around building emissions and transportation emissions, et cetera, to really help us get to those goals. Nancy.
I have to disagree with
Okay.
I don't think we are making significant progress. I think 17% reduction is just a dribble. And so I really question your first bullet.
The first bullet, there are some specific goals we are getting closer to. So for instance, one of the targets in the ICAP is to transition 100% of our municipal electricity to renewable sources. So we are getting closer to that through the PSC programs. And then another one that is we're making progress to that I would say, we are not achieving yet. But for instance, is the energy use reduction in existing buildings, right? So there are specific targets in the ICAP around percent reductions there that we're making more significant progress to. We still have a lot to go there, but luckily the data is showing that we have made progress towards that, whereas some other targets where we're far off. Yes.
So I guess my comment to you is, though, we are trying to get more funding and more ability to do this. And by saying we're making significant progress, they decrease our efforts to get more.
Okay.
And you see, we're working to get there, but we aren't there yet. If we have got solar power now running the pool, community center, and yeah, we've done some stuff because those are things we can control, but we don't have any of that. We may be trying to get there. So I really question your first bullet, and if that's the message you want to send to city council. Because I disagree with you. And that's just my opinion, but I don't know how the rest of the board feels. I think we have a long ways to go. And I think we need to continue to make efforts to try and reduce our greenhouse, emissions, demonstrate leadership to businesses in this community that we are doing things to be climate friendly so that people like Costco and REI follow our lead. And that's my challenge to you is let's not send the message we're making big progress. We are working towards a goal, but we've got a lot of work to do.
So maybe it's a reframing of things so that
we're doing things, but we've got a lot to do.
Right.
To meet our goals.
Yeah, I agree with Nancy. I mean, I think I also don't think that this is an ICAP update. So I do wonder if that first bullet should be specific to emissions targets and like our performance against emissions targets in the ICAP, which I I don't know how we performed, so we should probably have the numbers of like, what was our target for 2022? How are we performing relative to 2022? But I do agree with Nancy that I think the first bullet doesn't accurately, like, I think what we could say is we've seen reductions, but a lot of it has come as a result of actions outside of Issaquah. Like, that's the message I get from hearing this is we're benefiting from PSE, but we haven't actually, there's not been significant change within the community, which I think is what we're trying to get done with the ICAP is we're not just going to sit and wait for PSE to change their mix. Like, so I do think that the messaging here is just in a different focus than I would have taken.
Sure.
But yeah, I do think that there's talking about how we're performing against overall emissions targets and the addressable portion of that and like what is actually happening within the community is how I would focus that bullet.
And if you're talking to council, we've got a long ways to go. And if we can get that message and we need their support, their financial support, their network support, because they get connected with businesses and, you know, community leaders and tribal leaders and state leaders, and we need their help. And so we want them not to back off on the pedal. We want them to push it harder.
Okay.
I think the mention of the light rail is a good example of that. Putting our hopes on something in what 2046 is. It seems something that it's like, I mean, it seems kind of crazy for us to be like, we're gonna get there by the time it's too late, right? And so the idea is to say instead, well, how do we use that power when we know we're the last stop? What is it that we want, right? We recently were rejected for funding from Olympia to even examine what it would be to put a lid. Right. And so it's like, well, that didn't work. So what else are we going to do to say, if this is the case, what do we want? Right. I haven't seen big discussions happening that transform us from saying, what big moves do we want to make? We have a goal. We know where we want to go. So what are we going to do about it? I see it's being much more passive, and this may be an opportunity to talk about what is it that we want and how do we then continue to push that forward. I also don't see anything right now. I know that it's a tangential thing, but right now we're not talking about any inventory of and chemicals that are being used by the city. And we know there's a direct causality from those with carbon emissions on the natural environment. And so while it may not be a part of the metrics right now, I do think it's an important thing for us to be tracking and to be saying, how are we actually using, where are we using? I love those little signs that I find all over the parks, right? Where children are playing saying, this has been recently treated. If you have any concerns, you could go and call this, right? So it's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Again, children playing all around these, these little signs. I would love for us to be thinking about when we have our greenhouse gas emissions, that it's not just what's coming out of our exhaust pipes, right? There's a whole ecosystem that can be impacted as well. And I'd like to see a little more targeting of that.
I think Nancy made a good point about talking to council here. So you want to lead council down the path of we need to be a leader in the region and show a good example of taking care of our own house first, where we can make a change, even though it's only 1% of the total emissions of Issaquah. At least we're showing an example, and then we can make a change there. So that's significant word. Yeah, that jumps out by my council member, and I see that. Hey, look at us, great. And that's not reality. I think you heard it throughout your presentation. It needs to be kind of reformatted in a way where you lay out some ground steps up front, how the model's set up, how the regional efforts work before you get into the weeds on the numbers and graphics. Sure.
Where do we go from?
Dixie, I think once Dixie goes, I think we probably will need to wrap on the section just because we are coming up on time. So
I think we're good on the slides. So yes.
I think, and maybe we'll talk about this when we get into our goals and our retreat, but in my opinion, and I said it before, I think we need to be the squeaky wheel. And I own a business in Issaquah, and I can tell you from my perspective, there is no talk about green anywhere in our world. It does not come through to us. And I am in a green business, right? So there's no incentives. Like I get frustrated with this all day long. There's no incentive and I have a green business. Why is Issaquah not supporting me? So what that tells me is the council, we're not a priority, perhaps. And I know they have a lot to do. Government's complicated. But I think this could be a great start in us saying, listen, we're not gonna take it anymore. And we want to see change and this, and you know, we're here because we want to see change. And so let's be a squeaky wheel. That's all.
Can I just add one thing to what Dixie said? And
Sure.
I had mentioned this before, you know, bringing up to what she said, green businesses, you know, City of Issaquah should start programs where they give incentives for running green businesses, you know. There should be a carbon tax versus, you know, an incentive, green incentive. Means there should be this discussion brought up to city council or somewhere. The city needs to do that to actually get it to the community and encourage, you know, businesses to step up.
Just a note for everyone's piece of information. I actually get taxed extra because I have a consignment store.
Seriously?
I have to pay an extra B&O tax. It's not Issaquah, but I have an additional 1.5% I have to pay on because it's a service. I still think I shouldn't have to pay sales tax. My customers shouldn't pay sales. We never paid sales tax on it. Why are they paying it? That's a whole nother day.
And carbon tax is not new. The state of Washington has been doing that for big industries and big companies for a while now. So, you know, that is something, and I know it's not in your area, but that is something I think the city council should be brought.
This is a great segue, I think, for our next thing, which Dave, do you have everything you need? Because I think
I think this has been very helpful. I will say there is a lot here. So if you have specific questions, I have a number of slides pulled up on other graphs. So if you want anything additional, come grab me right now or afterwards, and I'm happy to chat more and more and more about this with y'all. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Nice work. It was a difficult topic you navigated there.
Feedback.
Right, I think that wraps up our standard agenda items. The next item we have is proposed content for environmental board and retreat. This, Don and I think we're starting to hear some of this was great. We started to hear some of the things from board members that we haven't heard before. I think that is the goal for this retreat we have coming up. We're going to be pulling together some resources to hopefully get the juices flowing in advance of the meeting, but I think the biggest thing that would implore everyone in advance to be thinking about not just what do we want to do this year, but what are the goals for Issaquah in the longer term? What should the goals of the environmental board be that are consistent 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and that we make sure that we are staying on top of, regardless of what else might be going on within the city, that we're always staying on top of. So our goal is to provide some more context, some more inspiration for materials in advance of that meeting, but that's something that I hope everyone comes into that meeting feeling like you've given that some thought, that you've thought about what you're passionate about, you've thought about how the things that you'd like to see happen in the city and what the board could be doing to help those things, because I think that's overall what a lot of the feedback out of the survey was we just didn't feel like the identity, like we didn't have an identity as a board as much as we felt like we should. And so I think this is our opportunity to have a conversation about what is our identity, what are our longer term goals, and how do we go about doing that. So there's more detail to come. Don, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Just format. We talked about having multiple tables, maybe 3 to 4 people per table. If we can get some council members there, have a council member or so at each table. I'll throw out an idea that, if we can pin down one of the council members per table, maybe we can quiz them up front, have them bring the top 3 goals for the environmental board over the next 5 to 10 years. And then you could bounce back your goals to the council member and have a discussion about that, kind of see where we land against where they land. Yeah, to echo what Jamie said, don't think about it as a 2024 work plan meeting. We want to think about it more as a long-term driving force in the environmental portion.
And we may have some other attendance. I don't think that that's going to be a major component. So I do think the majority of who you'll be talking to there will be board members, and it's about getting your perspective. I think if some others join from council, that will be yeah, they might be able to provide, and they will be able to provide some valuable context, but at the end of the day, it's about us and you all bringing your perspective. So don't feel like if someone shows up that is on council, we don't know if that's going to happen. So I wouldn't rely on that. And even if they do, I think this is still about your perspectives. Like, to a certain extent, they don't matter. This is our meeting. So let's make sure that we don't get turned off by what anyone else might say. Like, it is, I think, at the end of the day, about us bringing our perspectives and coming to the table. I think also getting to know each other a bit better. I think that'll be a fun opportunity as a result of this too. We do have a social component. Like, we're going to spend some time before we launch into all the things that Don mentioned about just to get to know each other better. I think that was feedback that came out of the survey as well, that will help us be a stronger unit and get to know each other.
Is the public invited, and do they get to participate?
It'll be a public meeting. I think one component we might talk about at that meeting is community engagement. If there is time, that could be one of the agenda items, but it will be a public meeting.
So if we have round tables that we're sitting at 5 or 6, will the public sit with us at each table?
We're having a planning meeting with Andrea Snyder, Deputy City Administrator, soon. So we can talk about that opportunity.
Curious.
Yeah, that was not the intent right now, but we can at this point, but we can discuss that as an option if that's. Yeah.
One of the other suggestions, and I see you out here, Henry. So I do think one of the other things that, please feel free if you have, there's things that you think should happen during this meeting that you really want as priorities, either format or otherwise, please make sure to send that to Stacy. You can include Don and I if you'd like, but Stacy and David, to make sure that that's getting incorporated. Because yeah, again, we do want to make this we have a starting point for what we hope would be a valuable process and format for everyone, but we want to make sure that you guys are also providing input on how to best come together during that meeting. So that's part of the reason we wanted to give you a little bit of context on what it was going to look like, so that you would have the ability to react and send along any other requests or suggestions. So, Anne, go ahead.
Will there be snacks, or shall we make it a potluck?
I requested a light dinner that was turned down, but I think we'll figure out a way just to at least get some drinks and cookies there. So, but folks,
yeah,
we'll send more information. Folks are welcome to bring their dinner or shared snacks too. We had shared snacks at our December meeting for those of you that missed it.
Yeah, I mean, we could easily make it a potluck, right? It is during dinner time from 5:30 to 8:30.
Yeah,
Shareable food.
We'll be sending out a lot more information next week.
Cool.
I think with that, that is our one report. And there's one other business and announcement.
Nice to 2 minutes of quick updates. I'll try and keep it to 2 minutes. Really quick updates on council. January 2nd, they did approve the municipal building decarbonization resolution with an amendment to include a work plan that would be delivered at the end of the project and presented back to council and the environmental board to kind of provide direction on what are the next steps coming out of the analysis. David's working to finalize the scope of work, and we anticipate we'll be bringing that report to you all this summer and demonstrating alignment with any proposed budget requests. Next week, going before council, is approval of a just under $100,000 solar plus storage grant from Commerce. This is for our Resilience Hub project that we've mentioned several times, have not talked to you about in detail, but we will be doing so in the future. Also a solid waste assistance grant that's going to continue our work with schools on restarting their recycling and composting program, as well as bringing some waste reduction efforts to city-sponsored and community-sponsored events. February 5th, then, going before council, is the environmental board report and the greenhouse gas inventory. I'll make another note about that meeting in just a moment. A couple other quick items I wanted to mention. I was going to have David talk about the Evans School project. I'll just mention it really quick. Some of you may be familiar with the University of Washington Evans School. They have graduate students that perform as consultants for public entities for the most part. We were lucky enough to get one of those cohorts this year, and they're going to be working with us on a carbon sequestration project, identifying programs that we could initiate on private and public lands to support carbon sequestration. That scope is still being refined, but we anticipate having them come and talk to the board at the end of that project in the June time period. Within your packet was our working draft work plan that will be informed by our discussions at the retreat. While we'll be talking kind of longer term, as Jamie was mentioning, we will use those conversations to inform our short-term work plan. But just wanted to continue to provide that to you so you have a heads up on what staff anticipate needing to bring to the board. But again, we'll be reworking that based on outcomes of the retreat. Real quick, just to highlight some of the upcoming meetings, and I did this in the recent email. We have the January 25th retreat. January 31st, we have another special meeting to review the full environmental stewardship and climate resilience element. We will be sending out that full element around the 19th to allow time for folks to review, send us track changes, send written comments ahead of the January 31st meeting. For those of you that were around last year, we're anticipating running that meeting somewhat like we did Title 18. I know it was a very painful 4-hour meeting, but it was very productive and it was very valuable having those comments ahead of time so we could work through them all at the board. So anticipate that later this month. I know we're asking a lot of you in January. And then February 5th, we do meet with council to present the board report and greenhouse gas inventory. You do not all need to be there. That is optional. Jamie and Don are planning to be there. You are all invited as we share the results of that report and hopefully some of the results of our retreat as well. I can send out another reminder about that. And then the last meeting I'll just highlight is our regular scheduled meeting for February is February 14th. I am in conversations with the Parks Board about possibly having a joint meeting at the end of February to discuss the urban forestry management plan. If that gets scheduled, I would like to cancel the February 14th meeting because we do not need more special meetings on our calendar, but we may see a shift in the timing of that calendar, or sorry, of that meeting. That was a lot. Any questions? I can send, I'll send another summary out of those upcoming meetings in the future, but any questions on right now? Okay, it's a busy January. Thank you. We have a lot, but hope to lighten your load later in the year.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.